Well, there's no need to drag this whole thing out. Let's just go ahead and bust out the checklist. Alright, let's see here. Fixed camera angles, check. Limited inventory, present and accounted for. Incremental exploration requiring backtracking across the environment. We definitely got that. Tough puzzles, tank controls, resource scarcity. That is a value-sized affirmative right across the board. Well, guys, according to my rigorous testing methodology, we're looking at a genuine survival horror game here. Now, whether or not The Mute House is a good survival horror game, that's going to take an even more involved battery of experiments, and lucky for you, I'm just the man for the job. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Like most of the projects I tend to cover on here, I discovered The Mute House while browsing Twitter, so I followed its developer, and to be completely honest, the project sort of slipped out of my head as there weren't all that many production updates and it had taken quite a long time to come out. And doing a bit of research for this video, I found out that this was all put together by a single person, which not only puts the time spent on completing it into more context, but it makes it seem relatively short, all things considered. And you know, in that same spirit, let's go ahead and dive into the meat of this thing.
That maniac, he's still behind me.
Now, if you guys haven't noticed yet, typically with one of these videos, I'll outline a game's story first and then move on to things like gameplay and presentation. But to be honest, there really isn't a whole lot here in terms of narrative, so we might be wrapping this section up a little faster than usual. At the start of the game, we get to hear an answering machine message left by a girl named Amber for her sister Emily. Amber says she's going to be home late, but she'll be alright because she's with a bunch of people. Now, God only knows how that situation led to this one, but some indeterminate amount of time later, we take control of Amber as she flees this weird-looking guy wearing a doll mask on his face. With the goal of slipping her pursuer, she dips into the basement of a creepy mansion, which is like rule number 1 on page 1 of the survival horror guidebook. At any point, no matter how bad the situation may seem, it can only be made worse by entering a creepy old house. And as anyone could have predicted, this move does end up leading to her getting caught. The game proper starts a few days after this incident as we take control over Amber's sister, who turns out to be a local police officer. Even though her comrades in arms are already in the process of working this missing persons case, Emily's decided to take things into her own hands, given how long Amber's been missing and the likelihood that she'd ever be found if the investigation goes on much longer. In spite of that, though, she's in communication with a fellow cop as she stands in front of the house, and he says he'll try his best to run interference for her so she can operate without anyone else coming in and messing up her solo mission. And I sure hope you cherished this story cutscene while it lasted, because outside of your cop friend trying to get in touch one last time, you will not be seeing another one till the very end of the game. It seems like Emily's personal motivation to find her sister merely acts as a believable reason to get her inside of the Foley Mansion, and once she's crossed that threshold, things shift into a focus on whatever happened here and why there are flesh-hungry zombies roaming around.
Kurt, something's wrong here. There's a corpse in here.
And in true survival horror fashion, this specific plot thread is delivered 100% via journal entries and personal notes scattered across the property. As we come across these snippets of exposition, we find out this place used to be the home of a famous actress named Diane and her egghead husband Hector. A pairing that smells a little weird from the start, but things get even stranger as the woman of the house falls ill and her husband, in a desperate attempt at developing some kind of a cure for her sickness, starts digging up corpses to experiment on. Eventually, though, the bodies of the deceased stop being a worthwhile avenue for his weird scientific curiosities, so he instructs his mentally stunted but physically gifted sons to venture out into the surrounding forest and mountains looking for hikers or people looking to camp for the night so he can try vigorously applying the scientific method out on some living lab rats. Which explains not only Amber's disappearance, but the rash of missing person reports that this town's been the recipient of lately. And since there isn't exactly a lot of raw material to work with here, I'm gonna go ahead and give everyone a chance to skip past any story spoilers by heading to the timestamp on screen or using the YouTube chapters. Like I already said, there isn't a whole lot here to spoil in the first place, but there is a bit of a twist at the end that I think is worth not ruining if you plan on checking out the Mute House for yourself. Alright, as Emily continues her search for Amber, the developing origin story of this house of horrors begins to come into clear focus. Like I already laid out, the husband in this scenario is driven by a desperate attempt at keeping his wife alive, but running alongside this tale, a bit of a side story starts to develop. This whole time we've been coming across the personal accounts of the house's butler, Robert, a man who's been working for Diane Foley essentially since she was born, and like Hector, he's dedicated to staying by her side. Through this perspective, we get to hear about Mr. Foley's descent into madness and how bad things had gotten by the end. At one point, our resident mad scientist discovers that his wife's disease seems to abate when she's subjected to extremely low temperatures. So like any rational person would do, he sets up a refrigeration system pumping super chilled air into her bedroom with the hope of slowing down her eventual death. A move that apparently wasn't enough to fully halt her decline, as a diary entry from butler extraordinaire Robert informs us that Diane died in November of 1969. An event that didn't exactly do very much to her husband's resolve, as his new mission soon became to find a way to bring her back to life. Our guy Robert is understandably skeptical that that's ever going to happen, but he's just about as dedicated to the late Diane as the guy who married her, so he decides to stay on as a butler and facilitate Hector's continuing experiments. During this time, Hector creates what he calls a revenant and what I call a dead body brought back to life. And while it is in the ballpark of what he's striving for, the fact that these things don't retain any ability to think means it's not exactly an ideal solution for his current problem. But undeterred as ever, Hector continues his experiments but switches over to living test subjects, which is what drives him to start sending his sons out to capture hikers and campers from the surrounding mountains. And our guy stays riding that high of being able to create zombies in a lab until about 20 years later, when he's essentially reached the literal and metaphorical end of his rope. In one last-ditch effort, he develops a Hail Mary injection containing all of his combined efforts to revive his long-dead wife, and when that fails, he resigns himself to stay in the makeshift meat locker he's designed for her forever. The guy's racked with guilt, not only just for the atrocities that he's committed, but the fact that they all ended in failure, so he lays down beside her and ends things on his own terms. Which should have ended his reign of madness, but there's a catch. All of this time, Hector's made it incredibly clear to his mentally disabled son Cain that all of the slaughter and bloodshed has been necessary to revive his mother. So even after Hector checks out, Cain continues some approximation of what his dad was up to while he still had a pulse. Now in the meantime, with both of his employers dead, Robert decides he wasn't about to be the odd man out, so he sets up his own, let's say DIY finale. But just before he slips away, Diane Foley shows up and takes the rope from around his neck. In a note, Robert says that she's weak but alive, so he scoops her up and takes her away from the house of horrors that acts as a byproduct of her resurrection. By the time we come across this note, Emily's finally found her sister Amber, who's alive and maybe not well, but definitely alive. During the final climax, Emily sets the house ablaze and dumps a staggering amount of 9mm into Cain, leading to a nice little reunion in front of the inferno that used to be the Foley mansion. All in all, I'd say it's a nice little bow to put on this whole thing. But before we consolidate our thoughts on all of this, let's fuck with everyone who skipped the spoilers. The human mind can come up with some pretty wild stuff, but at no point when starting this game did I imagine it would all be the work of ancient Egyptian aliens in cahoots with the Bolivian government, and that the Mute House would share the same narrative universe as the late 90s spin-off show Stargate SG-1. Alright, so like I already said, there isn't exactly a lot of story in the Mute House to go over. The general format is, we start with the inciting incident of Amber being snatched and her cop sister Emily going in alone to rescue her. Then for just about the entire game's runtime, you're going to get nothing pushing that plot forward, but instead an offshoot story concerning the Foley mansion and what led to it being filled with the living dead. So we've basically got all of our bases covered. The initial event that leads to the player being in the house, and then the mystery that might have them wondering why they're gunning down zombies. And it seems clear to me that the second one is the story that the Mute House's developer really wanted to tell. But at the risk of shitting on a labor of love, it wasn't exactly my favorite tale ever spun. Not that it didn't have some high notes or end on an actually compelling note, but I just wasn't feeling the flow of it. I mean, if we look at things a little more objectively, a lot of your typical storytelling essentials are checked off, but there just wasn't anything here that I personally connected with. I think it might have been easier to get me over the threshold of interest if maybe things weren't so bare bones, or if there were any interactions with a living representative of the Foley House section of the plot, discounting the son. But I do sort of see the value in Emily essentially stumbling her way through finding out these details long after the mystery's taken its course. I'm a little torn on this one. On one end, it serves its purpose of giving me some kind of a non-gameplay oriented reason to continue playing, but the story doesn't really go out of its way to be anything more than that, which, to be fair, may have been intentional. It'd be a lot easier to criticize this story if it were told poorly or if it didn't have a satisfying conclusion, but I think this is one of those situations where I just didn't get into the general vibe. Truly, I can't point at any one thing that turned me off or anything. It just wasn't to my usual taste, I guess. Which means I can't really say if anyone else would find it interesting. An idea that doesn't bode well for a guy whose job it is to do just that. So let's throw a tentative meh at the Mute House's story and jump into what I find to be its best asset, its gameplay. When I describe a game as being classic survival horror, I'm typically pointing at the earlier parts of the genre's existence. Think Resident Evils 1 through Code Veronica. But in the Mute House's case, I have to be a little more specific because this game feels to me very much like an RE1 type of situation. Meaning that it's got a solid base of the genre's typical early gameplay foundations, but doesn't go too far outside of that to do its job well. The Foley Mansion is an absolutely perfect setting for this type of game, with more locked doors than unlocked and a good number of esoteric puzzles required to progress further into its depths. Moving around is handled with tank controls.
My favorite.
And I'd say this is a really good implementation of that system. Running around the mansion's relatively narrow halls and larger rooms feels nice and smooth with great turning and running speeds. I did notice that using a D-pad had me needing to make these constant micro adjustments to my heading to keep from running into any walls, but this was solved by using the analog stick instead. Of course, as some of you already know, I am a stuck-in-my-ways old guy, so I chose to stick with the D-pad regardless, and this small issue never led to any deaths or anything like that. Truth be told, the only thing about this that really bothered me is that it would make the footage showing up in this video look a little wonky, so it was more of a vanity thing and not a real issue with the broader controls. Really though, I could care less if the game's tank controls somehow had a hand in the 9/11 attacks, because for the first time in the genre that I can think of, we have the ability to run in reverse.
Deja vu, I just been in this place before. Higher on the street and I know it's my time to go.
Which I know is gonna sound like a bit, but just imagine how much better your favorite Resident Evil title would be if you could dash backwards. I mean, we're talking game-changing stuff here. The only real downside with this is that I found out it was possible like 2/3 of the way through the game. And I feel like that's really understandable because who the hell's gonna try to run backwards in a survival horror title? Also, the progression of coming across keys, items, and new puzzles felt really well balanced with a nice flow that kept me in a moving forward sort of state for just about the entire time. There were exceptions to this, but we'll get into those later. Now, as you're running around searching for the next new area of the mansion, you will have occasion to draw your firearm and transfer some bullets from your magazine into the bodies of freshly revived dead people, and I'll say the combat here is just as fine-tuned as the controls. There is a slight deviation from the Resident Evil design manuscript in that you auto-aim at the closest enemy by default, but after a quick button press, you can go into manual aiming mode using a laser reticle as a guide. Something that I first assumed was going to play some pivotal role in the combat, but ended up only being necessary for shooting a single item in the last 5 minutes of gameplay. Outside of that though, blasting on these science experiments feels really good with a super satisfying fire speed compared to most games in the genre.
What was that?
Something that I would say kind of makes up for the fact that there were only 2 weapons in the game that I came across. But you know, it's a good thing that shooting at enemies works as well as it does, because the normal zombies in Mute House can cover a deceptively vast amount of ground when they're aggroed. I'm not exactly sure how to express this, but there's something about their movements or maybe their walking animation that makes it seem like they shouldn't be this speedy.
Get off.
And while you can technically avoid them, it's probably better just to clear a room out in most scenarios, unless it has a really wide open floor plan like this dining room here, where I can get away with only ever taking out the one zombie that spawns by the door on the far side of the table. However, if you do choose to lean more on resource conservation and fast footwork than the combat, which I do applaud by the way, the zombies' nimble speed and magnetic grabs make them a much more imposing threat than your average member of The Walking Dead. I found that ammo, for the most part, was just plentiful enough that I had what I needed to take care of most threats, but not so much that I was an unstoppable killing machine. The only exception to that rule is that you'll probably want to save most of your shotgun ammo for the mid-game when other enemies start showing up. Piggybacking off of that idea, throughout the entire experience, I noticed that the developer was very meticulous about including a good majority of the kind of tropes that you'd commonly see in some of the earlier Resident Evil titles. But not content with mere parody, they also made slight changes to those tropes so that the usual calm or temporary relief that they would normally give the player is replaced by a new source of stress. One of the better handled examples of this is how the game leans on a 50-50 balance between reward and risk. For example, equipping the powerful shotgun might net you easier kills, but it also reduces your run speed. And the more common healing items, which are leeches by the way, shout out to medieval medical practices. Anyways, using one of these doesn't heal you instantaneously, but instead it slowly brings you back to max health, and while it's working its magic, you're unable to run. So even the things meant to help you in your journey here are also going to be potential hindrances. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of an item box. You know, a place where you can store all of your spare items to keep your inventory freed up for potential stuff you may come across down the road. Well, here in Mute House, not only are these very limited in space, but their contents aren't persistent across the other item boxes. So for example, if you leave some ammo in one of them, you're not going to have access to that ammo from another location's item box. Let me assure you, these things aren't exactly dotting the environment, so you're probably going to end up with a smattering of various items scattered across 2 or 3 main area hubs. Something OGs might remember is being included in Resident Evil 1's original prototype builds. And you know, I think this is where the Mute House actually shines the brightest. Oftentimes in these independent survival horror titles, you'll see the game's developers experiment with common genre tropes, replacing typical mechanics or systems with something different to either change the experience for the player or just better fit what that specific dev enjoys the most. In last year's conscript, we saw the usual survival horror fixed perspectives replaced with angled top-down ones, and the addition of stealth mechanics along with weapon degradation. Likewise, You Will Die Here Tonight saw the inclusion of what boiled down to a live system. Basically, any character that died during the course of the game stayed dead, but the progress they made towards escaping the mansion stuck around, so you could eventually get to the end goal as long as you threw enough bodies at the situation. And you could say the same thing for its RPG-esque enemy encounters that led to stationary first-person combat. These are all features from what I would call amazing survival horror games, but I don't think you could individually call them survival horror mechanics. They're just really cool stuff thrown on top of the genre's usual foundation to add some flair or individuality. By comparison, here in Mute House, the systems in use are all just about as survival horror specific as it gets. I mean, if you strip this thing down, there's almost nothing included that couldn't also be found in the first Resident Evil game. They've all just been tweaked in order to add a not insignificant amount of difficulty. Like, imagine if you went to use a first aid spray in the fight with Jan, but you had to continue avoiding attacks without running for the next minute or so because the effects of your healing item hadn't fully kicked in and made walking your only option. Or what if the storage boxes and the aforementioned prototype builds made it into the finished game and you had to trek back to every single item box to grab the specific items you left in each? Like the title of this video says, the Mute House, for lack of a better word, is survival horror on hard mode. Almost every single element that you could call a staple in the genre can be found here, but altered to add to the stress and suspense that most people already associate with these games. For example, opening the inventory screen, instead of giving you a bit of breathing room from the terrors around you, leaves the game running in the background, albeit at a slightly slower rate. Thank God for that. So if you thought you were going to be able to casually just pause the game mid-combat and do some healing, load your weapons, or just take a breather, you better hope you got yourself a nice big lead on whatever you're fighting, because they can grab a hold of you while you're messing around in there. And speaking of that second to last point, the act of reloading has been made a little more involved in a way that I really enjoyed. Okay, so normally in one of these titles, you'd hit the reload button and your character would jam a new magazine into their weapon. When this happens, if there were any rounds left in the previous one, they'd essentially be carried over and added to the new one, along with however many rounds are needed for a full clip. Well, here in the Foley residence, things work a little more like real life. Popping a fresh magazine into your pistol is definitely going to get you to full capacity, but anything left in the last one is still going to be there. Now luckily, and this totally could have went the other way with how hard this game is, but Emily does throw her spare magazines on the floor and not in a garbage disposal, so you can get that ammo back, but it's going to be in the form of that same partially filled mag. And I really enjoyed this part. Your gun's current ammo count isn't displayed anywhere in the inventory, so the only way to check whether or not you're about to waste some rounds of 9mm is to hit the quick turn button while you're aiming, which will see Emily ejecting the current magazine and looking at what's in there. Now, this certainly isn't the first time I've seen a system like this being used in a horror game before, but I think it's the first time I've connected with it so well. It just fits in so perfectly to the kind of approach that survival horror usually has to game difficulty. Instead of being mechanically challenging to engage with, like requiring the player to hit just the right commands at a moment's notice, these games are more interested in challenging a player's tactical thinking and ability to plan ahead. Essentially, in a survival horror title, it's often more about what you did leading up to the fight and less about how well you perform in it. This is the specific type of challenge that the Mute House is looking to pose. Your inventory is incredibly limited and your ammo count doesn't stack past the max capacity of your weapon, so space comes at a premium and you really want to figure out what you're going to need before you get to where you're going, which is going to force you to keep at least some semblance of knowledge on how many resources you have scattered across the game's few non-connected item boxes. And like we already talked about, carrying a nice big shotgun in one of these games is usually enough to ease anyone's mind, but when having it equipped means severely limiting your movement speed, that becomes a bit tougher of a choice to make. And sure, you could just leave it in your inventory without equipping it, but you'll need to keep in mind that the game never pauses while you're rooting around in there. So if a threat does present itself, you better hope you can respond to it with enough time to make that a viable plan. Similarly, if you're in a fight and you've lost track of your ammo count, it might be momentarily more advantageous to just reload, potentially dropping perfectly good ammo on the ground, because depending on the situation, that might actually be quicker than running dry just as you're about to deliver the killing blow. And right when you're starting to make peace with all of these hardened survival horror mechanics, the Mute House throws you into this stupidly awesome section containing these creepy-ass, mostly blind enemies. And even compared to the already elevated levels of stress that the rest of the game has to offer, the tension here is just next level. These things can one-hit you if you get within their grab range, with the only nerf to their OP power levels being that they've got a few built-in disabilities. They're basically blind as a bat, but if they see your flashlight, they're going to start heading in that direction, and the same thing goes for the sound of Emily running. So you're obviously going to want to use both sparingly and only when you're an okay distance from any of these monsters. The only problem is there's next to no light in this section of the house outside of the moonlight cascading in from a scant few windows. So you can get yourself into a situation where turning on the light is your only choice, but you're not sure what's better. Running into one of these mutated bodybuilders in the dark and dying, or turning your light on, attracting one and dying. And just for fun, sometimes they're going to be straight up in the way of your progress, so you're going to have to make some noise or use your flashlight to lure them out and slip past them. Oh, and it gets spicier because as you continue forward, you're going to run into some of these things that'll keep what seems to be a random patrol route, which really ups the challenge. Honestly, this might be my favorite area in the game. It feels like a very doable hurdle in your way, but still enough of a threat that I had to stay on my toes and utilize some quick thinking. Every bit of survival horror game design orthodoxy is balanced by some amount of risk-reward here in the Mute House, and I genuinely find this to be one of the best features it has. I mean, don't get me wrong, I enjoy the hell out of fast, input and timing sensitive gameplay. I probably have more than 300 hours invested in Street Fighter V's online versus mode across the PS4 and PC. That stuff is definitely great, but I turn to these survival horror games to scratch a very different itch, and the Mute House has given me an unexpected twist on things I thought I already knew by heart. On the surface, this is a pretty by-the-numbers entry in the genre. I mean, if I just list off its features, like tank controls, limited inventory, item boxes, standard genre combat, resource scarcity, and puzzles, it sounds like any other game I've covered in the past. But once you dig into each one of those things, you start to find a very cool, deceptively engaging set of tools to mess around with. And you know, since we have sort of broached the subject, I don't think it needs to be said that this genre is built off the back of puzzle solving, but then again, I just did, so maybe it needs to be said just a little bit. Regardless though, when you come across a survival horror game, it typically slots into one of two categories. There's the more Resident Evil coded mechanical challenges, you know, stuff like pushing boxes, ordering button presses by some kind of a theme, or valve pressure gauges. Then you've got the Silent Hill side of the spectrum, which leans much more heavily on reading comprehension. In these types of puzzles, it's often necessary to go through a piece of text with a fine-tooth comb looking for coded hints that may require more than a little interpretation. And the puzzles that you're going to run into in the Foley Mansion definitely veer harder into that Silent Hill side of the column, which, full disclosure, I really suck at. Now, to the game's credit, these are the kind of head-scratchers that I eventually figured out with some critical thinking and a bit of experimentation, but in my opinion, they did bring my forward progress to a complete halt, which isn't ideal. There are a few really intuitive ones, though. Like, for example, there's this one in the cemetery where you're going to have to read headstones and translate what's on them to a deck of tarot cards, or this one in the library where you're given instructions on how to activate a series of floor switches with a story. There's a music puzzle where you need to match a full song with 4 different gramophones, and it really gave me problems, but shout out to the developer only including 4 of these, making it much easier just to brute force it. I'll admit though, I did have my fair share of issues with the piano one. I eventually got it down, but it took a good long while. Without giving away the solution, I'm just going to save you guys a bit of potential frustration by saying, just focus on the black keys. I actually had a joke here about that weird early 2000s surf rock post-punk band, The Black Keys, but I didn't think anyone would get it, so I took it out. Just so you guys know the level of care that goes into these videos. Like I was saying though, I did eventually get this one down without a guide, but I can't really say it wasn't mostly because of a similar puzzle in Silent Hill on the PS1. Now, I think it's important to re-establish that I tend not to do very well with these specific kinds of puzzles in any game, and because of that, they can often bring my playthroughs to a grinding halt until I wrap my head around them. I'm sure those of you who prefer SH2's hard puzzle difficulty setting will be right at home though. As for me, they straddled a very thin line between I figured them all out and it took a little longer than I would have liked. To give you guys an idea of where I'm coming from though, in my experience, Silent Hill 3's tarot card puzzle at the very end always takes me like an hour to finish every time I play that game, while the notorious water sample section is easily one of my favorite puzzles in RE3, so there's most certainly a chance that my brain is just wired up wrong.
Curt, this house. Crazy things happened here.
And speaking of that, it's probably time we switch over from compliments to critiques, but before we slip on the steel toes and start stomping, it is important to keep in mind this is a project developed by a single person. And that being the case, the goal here isn't necessarily to insult this person's work, but instead to inform any potential players of what they might run into outside of tough as nails survival horror gameplay. So if I do mention something that seems egregious to you, keep in mind that my overall opinion of the game is still very positive, and at the very least, at the time of writing this, the game's only $12 or $13 on Steam, which I think can excuse more than a few scuffs on the paint job. And the tip of the iceberg, I would say, is controller support that isn't exactly all the way there, the main problem area being your inventory. To be fair, if you're using the controller in combat or while you're running around the Foley Mansion, everything works perfectly, but as soon as you open up that inventory or use an item box, you're forced to control a cursor with the analog sticks as if you were using a mouse. Now usually this wouldn't be too big of a deal. After all, if a game wasn't made to work with a specific control style, then you just use what it was clearly optimized for. But I feel like when you work on a game like this, you need access to a good D-pad. How it currently works is you'll use the left stick to move the cursor way too slow and the right analog stick to move it way too fast. Now personally, this isn't the worst issue to get used to, but since the game does keep things moving when you have that inventory window open, this less than ideal method of menu navigation can make things veer a little too close to that unfair side of the spectrum. On this same level, I was really relieved to see that Emily had the ability to drop items because of her limited inventory, but there must be some kind of bug with this mechanic because the only way I could get it to work right was to break an item stack into a single instance of itself. I tried this with just about everything, and the only way to drop something was one unit at a time. Now, on the plus side, the developer is still actively working on bug fixes, so there is a better than good chance this is going to be addressed, and in the grand scheme of things, even if it isn't, it doesn't exactly bring things down to any significant degree. What does have more of a noticeable effect, in my opinion, is the decision to not include a map, something that's always been a pretty large pillar holding up the survival horror style of game design. As I'm sure most of you know, these games often rely heavily on the player returning to previously visited locations in order to further progress into the environment, and sometimes this can happen long after your last visit to said area. So it really can help being able to bring up some sort of a guide to point you in the right direction. Now, in the Mute House's defense, the layout of the mansion is actually fairly easy to keep in your memory, but I won't lie, there were a few spots that had me struggling to remember how to make it back to some specific room or hallway. I think the worst offenders, though, are a couple of locations that can easily be obscured by the camera placement. There's one in the basement next to the save room that can be really easy to overlook, but I think the worst one is this spot under the stairs. In both cases, there is a carpet on the floor leading to these doors, but that was something I really only took notice of after I'd realized that they were there. Before that, I got my hands on a key and I ended up circling nearly every single room in the mansion until realizing I could move on to a new screen if I ran slightly to the left instead of straight forward right here. And to return to the previous complaint, I think small issues like this would have been easily cleared up by the inclusion of some sort of a map. To be totally honest, I can't 100% say that this wasn't a conscious choice on the part of the developer to increase difficulty or maybe some sort of an overlooked aspect of the game's creation. On the plus side, this didn't even come close to ruining the game for me, but I can't also say that it wouldn't have been a little more user-friendly to have had access to a map. And I'll go ahead and warn you ahead of time, for this last one, I'm gonna get real damn petty. Okay, so I am very used to doing quick turns in survival horror games by hitting down and the run button, and that kind of muscle memory had me really struggling to keep in mind that the Mute House's version of this trick is performed with the right bumper. I truly cannot blame this on the game's developer, but it's just something that messed with my brain's limited capacity throughout the early hours of playing this thing. So if you are, like me, a graduate of the old school style of this genre, maybe expect a bit of neural rewiring to be necessary before it feels fluid. Outside of those small issues though, I would say the Mute House is well worth a little more than $10 to try out. I mean, it is wildly impressive that a single person was responsible for all of this, but more than that, it shows a very interesting and different perspective on the genre. In a lot of ways, it sort of feels like a difficulty enhancement mod that a person might make for the first Resident Evil game, and I use that as a compliment. Without a doubt, the Mute House shows a very clear understanding of how these games are meant to operate and only suffers from the kind of problems that I expect would be common to any low-budget, no-staff development project. It's a kick-ass but imperfect little addition to what has become the booming scene of modern Resident Evil likes, and my position on that matter has always and will always be the more the merrier.
Not again. You'll find new ones, Amber.
In terms of presentation, the Mute House is what I would call a perfect specimen of focusing your limited attention on all of the right visual elements. Because yes, it would be very easy to point out that the enemy you're most likely to come across in the game is represented by the same exact 3D model every time, or that Emily's sister looks like the pinup girl on a poster hanging in a very nerdy lumberjack's room. But I mean, come on, just look at the ocular atmosphere in this place. The flashes of lightning silhouetting everything in a dark room, the flowing leaves and bushes moving with the breeze, these absolutely tasty fixed camera angles. It's beautiful, and I'm fairly certain that these are 3D backdrops, or maybe they're just some of the most convincing 2D images I've ever seen in a video game. Either way, that's impressive. And on the note of things that get me stimulated in all of the right ways, real-time dynamic light sources with perspective-correct shadow casting, absolute chef's kiss. I'll admit that I spent an embarrassing amount of time just approaching objects from different angles to marvel at how well these things work, which I would say was time well spent in my view. There also seems to be a bit of motion blur going on in the character animations that I didn't notice at all until after beating the game, and this does a great job of blending animation frames together in a way that tricks the eye into seeing them as being way more smooth than they actually are. On the negative side of things though, this same effect is used for camera transitions, which I really can't explain why this is, but has always made me think of really low quality Unreal Engine projects. And since we're talking about blurring, the game by default sets its anti-aliasing to max, and that level's actually recommended in the options, but I found it to be a little too smeary looking. That being said, setting it too far below that results in some really bad aliasing on the edges of stuff like hair, so I found that the high option was a nice middle ground that let me see small details but kept lines looking smooth. And listen, I know I mentioned it not even a second ago, but you really can't discount how good these camera angles are. I've always thought that one of the best upsides to this style of perspective is giving the game's developer total control over how certain scenes are viewed by the player. It allows them to add so much more to specific moments in the game by utilizing the same camera angles that you'd see in a movie. You know, the kind that often subconsciously direct how you're feeling from moment to moment. And it seems to me that the person who created the Mute House has a very solid grasp on cinematography. Either that or some sort of naturally great eye for shot composition and makeup. And I'll level with you for this next one. I'm not exactly sure that I needed there to be jiggle physics on our main character, but now that we do have them, I'm not exactly going to complain about it. And you know, now that I'm thinking about it, it strikes me that we've had the tech to make boobs jiggle since the advent of the Sega Saturn, but why have we yet to see a game pioneer the art of booty physics? This isn't relevant to the Mute House specifically, but I mean, come on, games industry, there's an untapped market out here, and if we're gonna goon, let's goon. On a bit of a more serious note though, there were some issues that I ran into here that I can't exactly hand-wave away, and the king of them is something I'm sure all of you have already long noticed: the aggressive letterboxing this game uses. Now, I get that this was most likely a very conscious creative decision on the part of the developer, and I'm not trying to rag on someone's personal taste, but the aspect ratio here did sort of bother me. Not necessarily in a way that kept me from enjoying the game. I mean, it didn't take very long for me to no longer be able to see them, but it's more the principle of the matter. I mean, it seems obvious that the idea here was to go for a very wide field of view and potentially a more cinematic look, but in my opinion, it was really rare that the extreme edges of the left and right sides of the screen contained any sort of visual information that would sorely be missed at regular old 16:9 widescreen. Now, I can admit that looking back over my captured footage, just viewing it and not playing it, this choice does make for a very slick presentation, but I just sort of feel like the player should be able to opt in or out of that sort of thing. Maybe. I don't know. As I'm thinking more about it, I'm sort of talking myself out of feeling this way. I guess leave a comment whether or not this would bother you, because all of a sudden I don't know how I feel anymore. Outside of the whole ultra-wide thing though, I do think the animation that plays when you get grabbed by zombies stops sort of unnaturally. It's a very abrupt shift from kicking them away and your regular stance. And you know, even though I already said it wasn't a big deal, I do kind of feel like the game would have really benefited from a few more zombie designs. I totally get that the kind of hardships a single game dev is going to be operating under might make something like that a little more tough than it would be otherwise, but I would have liked a little more variety in the way these deadheads look. Now, all of that being said, we've got ourselves a comfy-ass save room theme and a persisting cat that you can actually pet, so when we factor that into the equation, 10 out of 10, no notes. The Mute House was a great little playthrough. My clear time clocked in at about 6 or 7 hours, and for less than $15, I'd say it makes for a killer, self-contained survival horror experience. Now, of course, there were little signs of the project's low budget, lack of staff, and English not being the developer's first language all around if you're looking for them. But there's also all kinds of examples of ingenuity, a creative outlook, and lots of love for the genre as well. The game really won me over when I realized that it was going for a tougher version of the classic form of that style that you'd be more likely to find in the first RE title. And when I came to see it as classic survival horror but more appropriately difficult, it was hard not to fall in love with it. That being the case, I have no issues recommending it to you guys. And if you do plan on taking me up on that recommendation, a little word of warning. Things may seem a little simplistic at first, but I guarantee you it won't take more than the first hour for you to realize, damn, I'm actually being challenged here. And most importantly, in a way that makes sense for this type of video game. So if you have 6 to 8 hours to burn and $12 in your pocket, I'd say there's not too much you could do that would be as rewarding as heading over to Steam and grabbing yourself the Mute House. I'd love to see this developer get the attention they deserve and enough of a return on investment that they're able to continue developing awesome survival horror games, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all looking for. And with that in mind, I think it's time for me to get back to work. Hopefully I get to see all of you again next time, but until then, I'm Jared.
What the hell?
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hey buds, big thanks for popping in. If you got a kick out of this video, I'd appreciate a little help putting out more like it. I've got a Patreon you could check out, or you could become a member here on YouTube. Either way, I'm thrilled you made it to this point, and I hope you have yourself a badass day. I'll see you guys later.